They put it into test, and it clobbered the other idea. And they went, it must be a mistake. And they tested it again and did even better. And so after that, they went, okay, give me a break, it is. And they've been using it ever since.
You're listening to Music Dialogue. Hear the stories behind iconic theme songs, scores, and jingles directly from the people who wrote them. Hi, I'm Nick Johnson. On today's show, I'm speaking with composer Michael Levine. Michael has scored countless films and television episodes throughout his career, but one song that he wrote early on may be his most memorable, the Kit Kat Jingle.
I had started writing music for advertising for Gray Advertising because the head of music there, a guy named Michael Cohen, no relationship to the crazy lawyer, someone had said, bring your music to Michael Cohen. He likes crazy stuff. And so I had brought him, excerpts from operas I'd written and string quartets, an electric string quartet. I mean, all sorts of wacky stuff. And remarkably, unlike everybody else, he didn't throw me out of their office, but he did say, okay, we'll keep you in mind for the unusual projects, the left field projects, he called them. So I actually had done a few things for them, and then using that, I started going to other agencies and saying, hey, hire me. And the head of music at Doyle Dane Bernbach, D.D.B. Needham at the time, was a guy who had seen a rock opera I had written when I was still at Berkeley, because he was the manager of the newly opened Berkeley Performance Center. And so he actually saw the first performance of this in that space and remembered my name rather remarkably. And so when I pitched them, he was like, are you the guy who wrote Worlds? And I went, yeah. So they kept looking for things for me to do, but nothing seemed to be working out. And he called me up and he said, look, I've got this kamikaze mission. The agency loves this jingle that they've been working on. They have a whole campaign built around it. They've already had Dr. John and Phoebe Snow sing it, and they just need a cannon fodder campaign. We need something that the client can reject so that that they feel good about buying what we've already spent, $100,000 developing. And so I said, great. And he said, I'm really apologize. We only have a little bit of money for the demo, can't hire union singers, blah, blah, blah. And so he paired me up with the junior most copywriter, because you have to realize they were throwing this idea away. And so Ken Schuldman and I met together, and Ken showed me a bunch of lyrical ideas. He had 2 pages of ideas. And I went, give me a break me off a piece of that Kit Kat bar. That could work. And I got in the elevator and had more or less composed the piece by the time I reached the ground floor. They were on the 3rd floor. It was a slow elevator. And I walked across town, and I sort of was playing it in my head. And I picked up the guitar when I got home because it sort of felt guitar driven. And I'm a reasonably decent violinist, an okay piano player, and no kind of guitar player. But it seemed right. And I called up Ken and I said, look, I've got something. I really think this is working. My apologies. I'm kind of a crappy guitar player, but it feels like the right thing. So I played it down. First person to ever hear the jingle. And Ken says, you're right. You really are a crappy guitar player. So that was 30 years later. They're still playing the jingle, but that was the first response.
Do you know what happened with them ending up picking yours?
Yeah, well, we actually I think I mentioned that we didn't have budget to do it properly, so I sang lead and guys from the agency sang backup, and it had this kind of unprofessional vibe as a result that the client thought was kind of amusing. So we did do a recording with a good bunch of musicians, and just as sort of we had session singers coming, but again, Chris McHale, who was the head of music, said, just for kicks, let's have the band sing it instead of our session singers, and we'll just have that as a backup because it kind of has the original vibe. And actually, the keyboard player, Gil Goldstein, who's a fine composer as well, was out in the restroom and missed the one take of the band singing it. Later, when it became this major use commercial on television, he missed out on tens of thousands of dollars in residuals, and he said it was the most expensive piss he ever took in his life because he didn't get to be on it as a result. But they put it into test, and it clobbered the other idea. And they went, it must be a mistake. And they tested it again and it did even better. And so after that, they went, okay, yeah, give me a break, it is. And they've been using it ever since.
I've heard that song referenced in the show The Office. It's been covered by lots of people. When did you know that this thing had become a big part of pop culture?
You know, it was a slow burn, and it was, I even had people tell me to take it off my reel because what my specialization in the advertising world was, I was the guy who could bridge the gap between sound design and orchestral stuff. And that's a lot of what I did was not songs per se. I think I only wrote a half a dozen jingles in the course of my advertising career, most of which did pretty well, like Wacky Wild Kool-Aid Style was another one that did pretty well. But it was ironic because I started out as a songwriter, but I found my niche in advertising as, you know, the cool sound design meets orchestra guy. And this jingle was just sort of, it caught on and it wouldn't die. They had to build a new Kit Kat factory to match demand. So something was going right. And every year, somebody from the agency would say, you know, I really hate that jingle. We are going to replace it this year. But just because we have to, we will have you record a new version of it and we'll run it up against our new, much better idea. And it would always win. So that went on for some years. I haven't done an arrangement of it in many years, you know, all the various different things from, one of my favorites was the sound effects, which played the actual jingle. It was kind of difficult to convince ASCAP that was the song, but it actually, it clearly is. So that was kind of fun. So it took some years, but I think that the icing on the cake was when a researcher at the University of Cincinnati did a study of the top earworms of all time. And now this is 2003, so it's a little out of date, but still, by then it had been many years since the jingle had been written. And the top three at that point were, number one was We Will Rock You by Queen. Number two was YMCA by the Village People. And number three was the Kit Kat Gimme a Break jingle. And I am very proud to be in the same list along with Queen and the Village People.
Beyond advertising, you're also an accomplished composer for film and television. You composed for the show Cold Case that was on CBS for many years. Can you tell me about getting hired on that show and what it was like working on such a successful series?
Like almost everything else, it happened in a way that you couldn't possibly plan in advance. The reason they even considered me was that the lawyer who was Hans Zimmer's partner's lawyer at the time threw my CD on atop a pile of CDs that they were giving to Jerry Bruckheimer to consider as people to compose the show. He actually thought I was the best choice, but that was, he had zero power other than being able to take my CD and put it in the pile. And it was just weirder than everybody else's. And so, because it still had all these, non-film music things. And one of the things that I think that people often make a mistake when they put together a film music reel is that they put together stuff that that's a lot like what people have already heard. And either through ignorance or arrogance, I never did that. I would always put in something that was a little strange. And so that got their attention. They wanted something new and different. And so I had a meeting with Jonathan Littman, who's the head of Bruckheimer Television. And this was, I think, in all honesty, he was still figuring out whether somebody as inexperienced as myself with television should be allowed to do this show. And so at any rate, you have to back up a year. I had, through a ridiculous series of coincidences, ended up playing violin on a movie that Harry Gregson Williams had scored called Veronica Guerin. And he needed an Irish fiddle player. And I had mentioned to him when I met him in, again, a story that is a whole long story in itself, that I played Irish fiddle. He asked me if I could put together an Irish band. I did. A few weeks later, he asked me if I could take a crack at this one scene that Jerry Bruckheimer had been torturing him on. He'd done 3 great jobs on it, but Jerry sort of had something in his mind that he wasn't getting. And I gave it a shot, and it went in the movie, and then the movie got shelved. So a year later, I'm talking to Jonathan Littman, and he goes, you know, what this show really needs is like music from this one cue in one of Jerry's movies that hasn't been released yet. And I said, what movie? He says, well, it hasn't been released yet. You haven't seen it. And I said, what movie? And he goes, Veronica Guerin. And I said, what scene? And he said, the murder scene, which was the scene that I had scored. And I said, I think I can do something like that. So that's, you know, none of that stuff is, that's really how show business works, at least in my experience. There's never a straight path from A to B. When you get from A to B, you have to go through Q.
You've worked with Hans Zimmer on several scores, providing additional music and violin. Can you tell me about what it's like working with Hans and your relationship with him?
Well, you know, Hans is probably one of the brightest people I've ever met. He is an excellent musician, but his real forte is that he understands story. Oftentimes better than the directors he works with. He's done so much of this, but also I think he just has a really great intuitive sense for story. And he knows what's going to work to deliver the story. And whether you like his music or not, you have to admit in seeing the movies that he scores that it propels the story. It makes it work. And that is really what the art of film and television and game composing is all about. Elmer Bernstein, who was, you know, one of the greatest composers in film, in my opinion, who ever was, who wrote, among other things, To Kill a Mockingbird and Magnificent Seven and Animal House and a whole lot of other things. He told me once, let me tell you a dirty little secret, kid. We're not really composers, we're dramatists. And I think that there's something about that idea that oftentimes gets neglected at, say, film music courses at music schools, because they make the mistake of thinking it's about the music and it's about the story. One of the people I really respect, for example, is Carter Burwell, whose scores oftentimes, I remember there was one particular cue in, I've forgotten the name of the movie now, but it's a Coen Brothers movie about this writer who has writer's block. But there's one particular cue where it's just strings that just holding one note, and it gets louder and it gets softer and it gets louder and it gets softer. That's the whole cue. And it worked fabulously for expressing the frustration of this character in this situation. And also he was being tormented by a mosquito. So I remember when I first met Carter, I said, that cue, and I described it, I said, that's really the soul of the mosquito. And he said, absolutely. Of course, he might have been pulling my leg. But that's an example of where you can't really listen to that cue out of context and have it make any sense. I think Cliff Martinez does that brilliantly often, too. But then, of course, you know, there are people like John Williams who write beautiful listening music that also supports the story, but it wouldn't work if it didn't support the story.
You wrote and produced the theme song for Resident Evil 7, which is a VR game, and it's the first VR game in the series. Have you worked on lots of video game stuff, and what do you like about it? Is it different than traditional television?
You know, the short answer is I haven't done a lot. I would like to do more. What I'm fascinated by from the scoring viewpoint is the fact that you have to be able to turn on a dime, that because the story, again, it's story driven. And so the music has to work for the story. And yet the story has all these bifurcations, and you've got to be able to make that work. So from a strictly technical viewpoint, it's a really interesting problem on how to deal with it. Now, in Resident Evil, I only wrote the theme song. I didn't write the score. The score was written by a number of people, a couple of whom are veterans at Capcom, who was the company who produced it, and a couple of other people they brought in. But that is something that I have done. I've helped others do. But in this particular case, it was the theme song. It's sort of an interesting story about the theme song. It came about because I had produced with Lucas Cantor, we had produced a cover of Everybody Wants to Rule the World that was sung by Lorde about 5 years ago. And that in itself is this sort of absurd story where it happened over July 4th weekend and it had to be done. And they had this kid from New Zealand that nobody had heard of at that point. They wanted to sing it. And I wrote it in what I thought was a good woman's key, and she sang it down an octave, which turned out to be really cool. And my stepdaughter sang all the backup vocals on it and sang a reference track for her. Her name is Mari, or Mariana Barreto is her full name, but she goes by Mari. And to my knowledge, Mari is the first person and the only person to have ever sung backup on a Lorde track other than Lorde. But at any rate, that ended up being used in Hunger Games Catching Fire. It became sort of a hit. And when Capcom asked me about Resident Evil, they said, well, we'd love to do a rethink of a classic piece like that. And the original piece, by the way, was this up-tempo, happy little dance tune, and I had turned it into this dark and scary, haunting tune with dramatic hits and so forth. So they wanted me to do a similar idea, but they didn't want to spend, $1 million on licensing a hit tune. And I was born in Japan and knew that there was a song called Musolinde, which was a Japanese kid song that the melody is based on a song called Go Tell Aunt Rhody, which is a traditional American song, in turn based on a traditional French song. And so all of that little musicological weirdness, I said, well, how about Musolinde? And they were like, you even know what that is? And I explained it was Go Tell Aunt Rhody. And I said, the original lyric is that the old gray goose is dead. And if it was changed to everybody's dead, well, we're getting closer. And then I wrote some verses for it and wrote new lyrics for that sort of explain their story. So it was a bit of a hybrid between this traditional song and a new song, but they bought into it because of this odd Japanese connection. So, whatever, once again, proving that absolutely no experience you've ever had is completely wasted.
You've probably worked on tons of projects throughout your career. Can you just tell me about one that you're really proud of?
Well, I tend to be proudest of whatever it is I'm working on right now, or something I've just completed. Really cool story. Got two of them I'm excited about. Well, maybe three, because I'm a piggy. Okay. One is that I have done a recording with Roberta Flack, and depending upon your generation, you may think of her as this vocal goddess, or you may have never heard of her. She had a bunch of big hits in the 70s, including Killing Me Softly and a whole bunch of others. She was huge. She did duets with Donny Hathaway that were very big, but she's been kind of not heard from in a while. And I was scoring a film called The 3100 about the longest foot race in the world. And we had a closing credit song that I'd written, which was about the idea of endurance. And the chorus says, and I'll just keep running until my race is done, because if I just keep running, then I've already won. And I said to the director, wow, it'd be really great to get somebody who people knew, a pop star, but somebody older, because it reflected the lyric. And he said, well, how about Roberta Flack? And I said, like, yeah, sure. How about, Ludwig van Beethoven? I mean, I didn't realize he was being serious. And apparently he was, because he'd worked with her on some charity projects. He knew her manager. What neither of us realized is Roberta had just not too long before had a stroke and was confined to a wheelchair and was living in assisted living. Nonetheless, she agreed to do it. And in one of those, you can't make this stuff up bits of luck. Her longtime backup singer is a guy named Dennis Collins. I knew Dennis from session work doing jingles with him, never knew he worked with Roberta. Dennis volunteered to go over to her place every day and teach her the song because it was really hard for her to focus for long periods of time. And she, came in, she worked her patootie off. The whole thing went, we ended up with something that I just think is great. And at the end of, 2 hard days of recording, she turns to me and she says, honey, if you need anything else, you just call me. I'll come right back. So that's a great story. I hope I'm not making a secret of the fact that I think that it would be awesome if she got a Lifetime Grammy award. She's done so much, and this is probably the last recording she's ever going to make, and so it's very special. So that's something I'm excited about, and it's complete at this point. The movie will be out in a couple of months. We're talking with various people about releasing it. So that's one. Another one, I did a wonderful album with Evelyn Glennie, who's one of the world's greatest percussionists, and we did some violin and mallet duets. I really got a chance to sort of do my electric violin thing, and she plays everything on this record. Interestingly enough, Evelyn's deaf, which is kind of, I remember when I first heard about her 20 years ago, I went, how do you do that? And she actually has a great TED Talk video where she explains how she hears, essentially through, every other part of her body other than her ears. But bottom line is, when you're working with her, she's just a really great musician and a lovely person, and that was really cool. So that's number 2. And then number 3, I'm very proud of the score that I wrote for the first season of Siren, which is a show that's on Freeform, and the voice of the mermaid, which has all this hypnotic power, is sung by Mari, aka Mariana Barreto, who I mentioned is my stepdaughter, and she is a great musician and did back when when the network was saying turn left and the showrunner saying turn right, the one thing that they all agreed on that sounded great was Mari. So we're very proud of her on that one.
In addition to working on many successful television shows and films, you helped create one of the most memorable jingles. What does that success mean to you?
Well, I consider myself astonishingly fortunate that I can make a living doing what I would be doing anyway. The difference is, if I had some other kind of job, is I would be doing that other kind of job, and I'd be squeezing this stuff in, catch as catch can. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, what's that line from The Usual Suspects, was making you believe he didn't exist. The greatest trick I ever pulled was getting people to pay me for what I would be doing anyway. But in terms of what my actual career is, other than wishing, of course, that there were opportunities to do a lot of things I've created that have not yet seen the light of day. I tend to have all these wacky ideas, and they end up being premature. I wrote an EDM opera 20 years ago. I did the first sleep concerts that I'm aware of were ever done 10 years ago with Matt Quayle, who's now scores Mr. Robot and a number of other shows. And he and I did this thing under the name Zeitgeist and Kismet. And so now Max Richter is running around the world doing sleep concerts. And we were like, been there, done that. So I always have these ideas that tend to be usually a little ahead of their time. And my only frustration is I wish I could get the synchronization of the ideas and the financing of it lined up. But having said that, I live in a nice house. I have a great life. I get to make music every day. So if I'm bitching and moaning, it's really, right around the edges.
Film and TV music is an unconventional profession. How much of the business is hard work and how much of it is luck?
They're both essential. And besides hard work, there is that whole question of a vision / talent / all those things that are very difficult to be very specific about. The closer you get to them, the vaguer the concepts get. But I've always said that people who say there is no luck have almost always been so lucky that they can't see it. And Conversely, people who say, oh, it's all luck, usually haven't done the work.
What does an average day look like for you today?
There's no such thing. Every day is kooky, and I mean, different than the one before. And I consider it a triumph when I get to spend more than half the day writing music or doing something creative. I also write scripts too. That's a whole other discussion, and have a couple of projects that are near fruition, but are not yet fruited. But we'll see what happens with that. But if I get to spend more than half of my day doing something that is purely creative, I consider that big time win. There's a lot of other ancillary stuff that goes with the nature of the profession. And I am a manager of my own career as much as I am a composer writer. I'm fortunate I have a great team. My wife, Marette, helps me a tremendous amount, and she comes from decades of experience of managing large programs in the third world that are nutrition oriented. She's gotten millions of people fed, maybe saved 1 million lives in the course of her career. So yeah, it gives you a little perspective about what's important. So she's great. Bijan Olia, who you dealt with in setting this up, who's a longtime right-hand man, is great. And there are a number of others who have helped out as well. So, I mean, that's another thing I'll say, is that people have this illusion of the lone artist doing everything. Nobody works that way, not in this business. I think Hans Zimmer was one of the first who was really, truly honest about it. And it shocked people that he was like, yeah, I'm going to put, Michael on the cue sheet because he wrote the Spider Pig choir arrangement. Okay, he goes down. And I think a lot of other people do the same thing. They just don't give people credit.
What advice would you offer to anyone that wants to advance a career in film and TV music?
When I first moved to Los Angeles almost 20 years ago, I called up the then head of music at Fox, a guy named Robert Kraft, not to be confused with Richard Kraft, the agent. Robert Kraft was the head of music at Fox. And Robert, I had known in New York, he used to have a band called Robert Kraft and the Ivory Coast. And we were friendly, and he had come up in the world, and I moved out here, and I called him up. I said, well, what do I do to break into this crazy business? And he said, well, the first thing you should do is change your name to Newman, which was probably a better joke then than it is now. But the Newman family is, certainly, the Hollywood music aristocracy. And yeah, it's the personal relationships are huge. So you don't know who is going to be the person who will open a door for you. So you have to find your peeps. Now, at the same time, you got to be really good at what you do. So you've got to study and you have to participate. But it is a community of people. And so I think the idea of the world beating a path to your door if you have a better mousetrap or a better scoring idea is probably a little naive.
That was a conversation with composer Michael Levine on his career and creating the Kit Kat Jingle. You can find out more about Michael at michaellevinemusic.com. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe. All the music used in this episode was created by William Ryan Fritsch, and you can find out more about him at williamryanfritsch.com.